right. Well, with that, I appreciate everybody joining. Thank you guys. We were making sure that we had all of our ducks in a row as we were
Mm.
getting off to the races. So appreciate y'all joining. How to bridge the gap between data and warehouse decisions. Um, my name is Keith Moore. I'm joined by Dan Keto. Let's go ahead and dive right in. Dan, just to get everybody kind of caught up to
Mm.
speed, can you do a quick introduction of yourself and what you hope people leave this conversation understanding a little bit more than they did before it started?
Great. Thank you, Keith. Appreciate that. My name is Dan Keto. I'm one of the co-founders of Easy Metrics. We started it off originally as a labor management software company, but as the warehousing and distribution world has evolved, the data complexity in those environments has scaled exponentially. And so we really are evolving our product into what we call warehouse performance management. And it really is about how to make use of all of the highly variant data sources that continue to grow within the distribution centers. Everyone right now is racing after artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all these great new tools that are out there. But fundamentally, they all sit upon the data layer and what we like to call the unified data model. And then so until you solve the data problem, it's hard to make very cost-effective use of these new technologies. And so really, what we're trying to educate the market on is, you have an invaluable gold stream within your operations data streams, but how do you actually approach sculpting that data and making use of that data to drive the value to your business? You look at Amazon. I live next door to an Amazon distribution center, and I actually get scared sometimes because if I order the wrong thing, it's already on their shipping dock before I figured out that I got the wrong order in, and it can show up here in 2 hours. So when you think about that velocity that is being pushed into the supply chain, that means you need that access to that data in a high velocity fashion and be able to make decisions on it. And so that's the evolution everyone's going through. And, as you well know, we have a very diverse spectrum of data sources. So some stuff goes back to AS400s from the 80s to modern cloud systems with, cloud APIs to hook into. So it is a very big challenge, for this industry to evolve through and to take advantage of these technologies. But, what we've seen with COVID is it really drove a lot of awareness of the criticality of supply chain. And so companies are really stepping up and investing and really looking for how to take advantage of the information that they have.
That's a great lead in for kind of, I think, what we're going to talk a little bit more
Hmm.
about. So for everybody's sake, Keith Moore, I'm the CEO of AutoScheduler. I'm down in Austin, Texas. Um, Much like Dan, AutoScheduler is focused on warehouse operations and leveraging data in warehouse, but we focus on a slightly different problem than what Easy Metrics is doing. So what we are doing is we are looking at the future-facing state of your operation and understanding how do we harmonize all the data across the different systems that might exist inside of a plant or warehouse operation? How then do we optimize that data to identify the best way to run a facility, manage labor, manage door constraints, space constraints, automation flow, overall inventory flow to achieve whatever the objective is you care about? That's generally maximize service, minimize cost. And then we identify what are the trends that we're seeing, or what are the behaviors that a site needs to activate or act on in order to drive overall throughput through the facility. Um, as a second background for everybody, so when we started the company 5 years ago, right, starting a company is hard, and I really needed people that could help me navigate the space. And so I actually call on Dan all the time for advice on, hey, how did you guys deal with this? Or how do you run your business? So there is a wealth of knowledge in this conversation that I hope everybody can take advantage of. And my expectation leaving is that everybody has a few nuggets on how they need to think about data, how they need to think about decision making, and how they need to think about activating that data to bridge that gap to how they use it for decisions as a whole. So Dan, with that, let's start and let's dive into some of the questions and conversation.
Hmm.
For folks, I do have I do have the questions open, so if you have questions, please ask them as we go, and I'll make sure to work them in through the flow of the conversation. So, Dan, you and I both do a lot of work in Fortune 1000 organizations. We've worked
Hmm.
with some of the biggest and best supply chains in the world. We've also worked with all sorts of smaller, boutique, unique, bespoke supply chains. And no matter the size of the supply chain, there's this general feeling that companies feel like they're data rich but insight poor in how they operate. If you don't mind, can you kind of unpack why it is that data has been the focus for a decade now? We've been talking about it forever. Why do people still feel this way, and how should they be thinking about getting a little bit more from their data?
I think one of the challenges is that in the past, data was important, but we didn't have near the volume we have now. And so I think what happens is people just get lost in the storm. There's so much information coming at them, and they have a difficulty in differentiating between what is important and what's not important to focus on. I was in the Navy many, many years ago, and the at the time the Blue Angels flew on the F-18 Hornet, and it was called a fly-by-wire system. And it had super high tech, dashboards and all this information coming at you. Problem is in combat, you had so much information coming at you, you couldn't actually fly the plane effectively in combat, and they would actually turn off a lot of the systems because it was just too much information. So I think what's happening with organizations is there's so much information coming at them that they get kind of lost in that cloud. And so the approach is to start at that top. What are the objectives? Then you start aligning the data to those objectives. And those objectives are generally going to be KPIs or KPI trends. Like I want to know what my cost to serve is, and I want to drive that cost down. I want to know, what my cycle time average is. I want to know what my failure rate in shipments are. You start building these baseline measurements to say these are the things that I'm going to drive my business to. And then you align that data underneath. Now, the key when you do that is you don't want to do that process in a silo. You have within any organization, you have what we call stakeholders. And so your CFO has a very specific lens that they look at their business with versus the supervisor versus the operator versus the industrial engineer. And so
Yep.
the key really is to bring everybody together and understand each of those stakeholder objectives, which rolls into those KPIs. And then you start going through the process and saying, okay, what is the data inventory that I have? What's available? What's not available? One of the things you're always going to find is there's lots and lots of gaps. And then you need to figure out, okay, how do I fill those gaps? What can I do with what I have now? What can I do with later? And so when you start, you may only have 4 or 5 major KPIs that you're working towards, but over time that'll evolve and waterfall down. And you'll get more and more granularity, but ultimately all that flows into those major KPIs that drive the success of your business. So I guess, in summary to the question is you really need to take a holistic approach, bring all the key leaders into that room. And it's a very painful process because they all look at their business differently. Industrial engineers want everything because they live in that world of granularity. And so they really, shoot into every little angle possible. Where the CFO is like, look, I just care about what my cost per case shipped is. And so you have to go through this process, and there's a lot of coaching involved to extract what those needs are and then align that to the data, KPIs, and so forth.
Yeah, I want to go on just a kind of a quick aside as it pertains to that.
Hmm.
One of the biggest mistakes I see companies make is, and you've seen this everywhere, right? Somebody says, well, I want, there's some objective I have and my board is pressuring me into AI, but we went and did an analysis and our data is not where it needs to be. Everybody says that.
Hmm.
We will talk about it at length. So don't worry, folks, that one's coming up. But let's say they say as a baseline, my data is not where it needs to be. And then you've got to ask the question like, why do you think your data is not where it needs to be? Everybody's data is imperfect. And so what you just proposed is the thing a lot of companies miss. So I want to make sure folks really key in on this is at the end of the day, we run a business. The business has objectives. There are different stakeholders that have different metrics that they track as a part of the overall business objective. And that business objective is going to change based on what industry you're in and what your business does.
Hmm.
But at the end of the day, we all operate a business that performs a function or offers a service or a good. And we need to think about our supply chain data as information that helps us dictate what decisions to make. And so the key thing is that mapping mapping the data to the decisions that actually need to be made in the process for decision making, right? When I'm in a warehouse and you're sitting and you're asking somebody, how do you decide where to put your people? They're going to give you a whole diatribe on, well,
Hmm.
first I need to look at what my orders are, and then I'm going to figure out how many people I have for the day, and then I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do that, right? That's that activation of how do you get the key stakeholders in a room and talk through that process of understanding what are the decisions that need to be made, and then work backwards on the data mapping on what is the minimum viable amount of data we need to make that decision.
Hmm.
Obviously, we have something. Now, it may not all be perfectly digitized, and that's a challenge to go through. And so making sure that you hit that key step in the middle
Hmm.
of there's a decision mapping process that has to go between the data and the outcome that almost everybody misses. And you got to use that as a forcing function for then deciding what data you're going to spend time or investment on. And if you don't mind, Dan, can you talk a little bit about that in something that you guys have been doing lately that is really unique on just the data model and how you actually think about a layer of data as part of the business? Can you talk a little bit about what Easy Metrics is doing and then how that is transforming how customers think about data in facilities?
So I think the big thing is we're really working with customers to think about their data strategically. When you look at a specific site optimization, that's one thing. We deal with customers with huge networks of sites, hundreds and hundreds of sites. And it's really fascinating to me is they may have the same WMS at every single site, but they have a completely different nomenclature
Hmm.
because at that site, they worked with the general manager and they call things a certain way and they want it a certain way. And they, again, do not think outside of their world. So then when you start to bring the unified data model together, you're like, well, wait a minute. This site is calling this exact same process something different. How am I going to mix and match the data if I want to do a comparative analysis? And it's a real big problem when you're looking at regions and roll-ups, but we have a really great customer in the Toronto area that has 11 sites, and every single site had different nomenclature within their WMS for the same stuff. So data has to be perfect to match, or there's ways to unify it on the back end. And so you really have to start thinking through this process holistically and strategically. Whereas in the past, data was, it was important, but you just never, no one ever looked at the real value in it. So, there's a lot of planning involved. And so you don't want to rush into this stuff. You wanted to step back and say, let's plan this thing and take that holistic approach, bring those stakeholders in. And then as you go through and do the build, as you know, you got to get IT involved eventually, right? To build the data structures, to build the different things to get that data to you. The last thing you want to do is a year down the road in the project, the CFO says, hey, no one ever talked to me, and I need all this other information in here. And the foundational data model that was constructed has to be torn apart because you need to move the kitchen from one side of the house to the other in order to accommodate that individual.
Yeah.
And so it's, we were not raised in data like the young people are today. And so there is a gap in that awareness, but it's being filled very quickly with AI and this just the need of data. So organizations are really investing in their people to understand that data. And so that's what we're, part of our process is to help fill that gap with education to because we've been doing this for so long. We help them build a common taxonomy for the nomenclature of the data sources. We help them identify the data sources, match those to the processes, match those to the metrics, because all of that has to match up if you're going to sit there and construct that unified data model. Now, for easy metrics, we build an abstraction layer, so we don't actually require them to go back to their core systems and change all the nomenclature there. We can bring that through into a unified structure in our process within the data warehouse that then matriculates through into our product. But ultimately, companies need to think this way beyond their specific function. And just within an organization, it's hard to get the industrial engineers to talk to the finance people. Imagine doing that across a network of 1,000 facilities.
And you just hit on something really critical, right? And I'm gonna
Hmm.
key in on the unified data model and what that enables, right? Because historically, even 5 years ago, 5 years ago, right? Anybody looking in warehousing, there's a labor management system, and then there's this new thing, whatever AutoScheduler was selling. It wasn't really
Hmm.
established, right? But decision orchestration. And um, so labor management system was for understanding performance of people, and that was what it did. And it was really straightforward on when you would use it and why you would use it. Decision orchestration, same thing. It tells you how to run the facility. But what a unified data model does, right, is when you start to think about what that provides for a facility, at a single facility in real time, anybody can tell you exactly what the state of that operation is. All the way, your CFO is going to know
Hmm.
cost per unit, and the tasker that is releasing work is going to know exactly the rates that everybody's operating and where they are in their plan for the day, right? And so that unified data model at a facility level is extremely valuable because it gives you all the metrics that people need for operational value. But when you take that and you scale that unified data model across your network, you get something even more powerful. And then this is a build for everybody's
Hmm.
sake, right? So one site is nice and you get operational value. All sites is a strategic difference maker that not everybody's investing in. Because if I know how all of my sites are performing under the exact same operational kind of unified data model, I know that I might have 7 different systems, like different WMSs that are running at those sites that all have slightly different ways of viewing the same data. Um, and I've unified that in a way where I can compare apples to apples the state of my network. And I can then start to understand if I know where we are right now, I can start to project some of that risk. And then with something like an auto scheduler, right, you get the
Hmm.
operational value on top of that unified data model to say, here is how you need to run the site and how much it should cost you per unit and what you need to be doing. But at a network level, it's also I'm the customer service rep for Walmart, and I can tell you tomorrow what's not going to make it on a shipment to them because I understand across the whole network, everything in a unified fashion, where we are and what's going to happen. And so you start to be a little bit more proactive and strategic about how you're thinking about problems, right? Supply chain disruptions, obviously, there's your black swan events, but most of the disruptions that occur that result in service failures happen in facilities, right? Trucks don't just get flat tires. And so when people think about what is the value of a unified data model, it's not just I have all my data in one place. It's the base level foundation for thinking about the next iteration of what your supply chain is
Hmm.
going to look like digitally. And that's really important for people. And
Yeah.
so, like Dan, I think it's easy to talk to when you're saying like operationally, this is what we do, and this is how we think about it. But like what you're doing and what Easy Metrics is built is transformative for I think how companies should think about their operations.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is foundationally, like you look at a WMS or a TMS or so forth, they're really just transaction systems. They collect the transactions and then
100%.
they'll hook into your your ERP, tell your inventory levels and so forth. When you look at the labor management system, it's a highly transformed data source based off of those inputs. And so, as you've said, originally it was just really about labor optimization, understanding performance levels, understanding where inefficiencies are. But what we did back, oh gosh, many, many years ago, we started appending cost data to it. And we've expanded that into, fixed costs being amortized out over activities. We've also been able to bring in revenue data. And then you have all the engineering data, all the different metrics that go into a process. And so you start to realize that that data string of that transaction that an employee or a robot performs, there's so much more value in it just than just the performance. And then
Mhm.
you abstract that into a network and you start seeing these variances that are occurring between these different facilities, and you can extract in those best practices to really optimize everything that you're doing. And then what you've done is you're really looking at that flow through the facility because you do the same sort of transformations of these data abstractions, and then you can see where these gaps are occurring. You can forecast, hey, if I change this or move this over here, I can maximize that throughput. And one thing that's I think is very exciting about what you're doing is we're seeing um, distribution centers evolve into more of a manufacturing operation with all this automation. This goes back to the book The Goal by Elijah Goldratt.
Yeah.
It becomes constraint management then, right? And that's why we work together because we can really tell you what the labor's capable of doing. But you have all these automation systems that have certain capacity constraints and stuff. How do we orchestrate this? When this machine goes down, how do we reroute the workflow so we can still meet our SLAs? And as you said, it all comes down to this unified data model. So as you sculpt this data, you really need to look at all these different factors of what you're trying to, these outcomes you're trying to achieve as you go through this build process. You can start easy, but it's going to continually evolve because your business is going to continually evolve. And, you know, I mean, as I'm sure you're seeing, there's all these new different automation systems coming online. How do we bring that in? How do we orchestrate that all the way through the operation and your data sources?
Yep. Completely. So let's make this practical for folks
Sure.
on how we build this, right? So we talked a little bit about some of the decision mapping and getting the key stakeholders. But if,
Hmm.
so let's say you walk into a facility, or sorry, to a company, and it's a fairly large company, runs a network of facilities, and you say, hey, we think you would get a lot of value in your supply chain from a unified data model. What does that process look like? So from a timeline perspective, who are the key stakeholders that need to be looped in to make sure that they're covering all of the corners that they might miss otherwise? Kind of how do you coach somebody through this process of building this model?
Yeah, so you're going to definitely have your operations leadership. I mean, they're generally going to be the champion because they're
Yeah,
the
that's
ones
number
trying
one.
to hit this operational success, right? I mean, because it hits the like, in your world, it's like making sure you're getting everything out the door on time and having that visibility into to throughput and so forth. We're about, really they understand where every penny is going, what the performance levels are, where the gaps are in their operation, and how they can improve that. We always ask to have the finance group in too, though, because we do such deep financial analysis. We bring in automation costs, robotics costs, and we're able to bring that through into the whole data stream. So then they understand, okay, the automation portion of this pick was this much, the forklift cost was this much, and the people cost was this much. And then we can bring in the revenue side of that transaction as well. And so they can understand if they're making profit or not. And so like all these different levels of visibility are critical. So I want those stakeholders in there. I also want the engineers, the industrial engineers, the
Yep.
continuous process improvement people, because they're going to have different data elements that they're going to need too. So we when we sell it for these large networks, we're selling it at C-suite, and so we make sure we have those right groups in there. It's always kind of funny when we deal with these big companies because when we one of the clients we sold, they had more people in the room than we had in our company. And we're the experts
Yep.
trying to explain to them how to do this. It's always kind of entertaining with these big organizations. Um, and so, you start out with just like, again, the macro. What are these big objectives? What are you trying to do? Okay, then we go through and say, okay, what are your data sources? What do you have available? And so we started a site then and said, okay, we're going to walk the site with you. And we're gonna walk the workflow from the time it comes into the door until the time it goes out the door. And I want to know where all the data capture points are. I also do the same thing for the employees. What are all the things that our employers are doing? Where are the data capture points and where are those gaps? Because there's always gaps.
Yep.
The best WMS will maybe capture 60% of the workflow on an activity direct cost basis. The other 40% is going to be indirect or what we like to call missing time, which is we have no idea what they're doing,
Yep.
which is, when companies haven't done this process is a huge cost factor for them. But once you get that visibility in there, that stuff can be then managed out of the system. You get more efficiency, more productivity, and so forth. So we will usually model out a small group of facilities first to really get everything dialed in, and then you can just explode it out across the whole network. But there's change management, there's SOPs, there's all these things you have to bring through into the organization because even when you put these systems in place, the system just doesn't run it for them. People have to take action. You have to educate them on it, and you need to have those feedback loops to make sure that they're doing that. And that's what we're excited about AI because AI is starting to help with the agents automate some of that change management process. So you don't have to have someone auditing to make sure the supervisor is doing the things they're supposed to be doing.
Absolutely. And from a timeline perspective, right? So if I heard
Hmm.
you correctly, right, we're gonna get all the stakeholders in. IT also, from my perspective, is going to be one of the critical ones that's looped in. Just
Hmm.
a lot of times they are the owners and the arbiters of data, and particularly for us at AutoScheduler, not only are we trying to get the data in one place, but we're also working on the decision automation. So
Hmm.
obviously, the change management of what decisions do you make and the compliance tracking of how well are you actually and optimally running the site. But there's also how much of that can we automate and free people up to do what they're best at. Like let's
Hmm.
let's gain value in your operation by taking some of the I think the statistics are a good operator can make about 200 decisions in a shift. And in warehouses today, there's hundreds of
Yeah.
thousands of decisions that actually need to be made in a shift, right? How do we take those and give that person the best five that they need to make, and we'll automate the rest of those. And that's a really IT heavy process.
Hmm.
Just making sure that there's trust and verification built into um, that model that we're working with them on. From a timeline perspective, what should people expect, right? Even at that first facility, what does it look like? And then beyond that, are we talking years, like,
Oh, no, 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 no,
WMS
no.
implementations?
Yeah, it really depends on the where the organization is and the level of the organization. So if we're dealing with large network facilities, like there's 3 to 500 facilities in the network, what we'll do is usually have an 8 week deep scoping process where we're bringing all those stakeholders together before we do any data extracts or doing anything like that. But if we're dealing with smaller groups, like they have 1 or 2 sites, we can get them time to value in 4 weeks.
Yeah.
So, assuming that they have access to the data or give us APIs into the data, we can bring that through. We've done this so many times; it's all mapped, and we can start getting them that time to value. And where we focus initially, again, this is assuming an organization has not done this before. The immediate win is squeezing out the missing time, which is the utilization. So, when an associate's working, you just don't want them standing around waiting for things to happen. And it's amazing how many little chunks of time throughout the day exist. And on average, an organization that hasn't gone through this process will have 1 to 2 hours per employee per day of unaccounted for time,
Yep.
or they're just not doing anything. And that's it's not their fault. They're waiting to be told what to do. And it's like once you start identifying that, you can get that out of the system very quickly. Then you focus on indirect time, making sure that's all being captured properly and that's being optimized. Because if you start focusing on productivity first, all the efficiency gains there will leach out into the other areas. So we have this process we go through with clients, and so the we can get them time to value within about 30 days, again at a single site level. But then there's going to be a change management and a process that they go through to really start optimizing things. And these sorts of things are ongoing forever, right? Because it's part of continuous process improvement. It's like, oh, okay, I'm noticing the cost here is higher than what the industry average is. Well, can I invest in equipment? Can I invest in slotting software? What are the things that I can do to bring my cost structure in line? Now, if I'm doing a network, it'll be generally 8 weeks of stakeholder involvement to really scope it. Then IT's involved to understand, okay, here's the data that we need to bring together. When we're dealing with large networks, they generally will bring it into a data warehouse product on their own, like a Snowflake or a Databricks or something like that.
Yep.
That gives us the best real-time hookups versus trying to to go direct into a production WMS. You just don't want to do that. That doesn't make for people to be really happy because of latency issues and that sort of thing. And so we'll usually do a small group of sites, and then same sort of thing, 4 to 6 weeks to get them to time to value. And then we do a lot of dialing in before we want to replicate it across their whole network. So in a sense, like the smaller groups where we are getting time to value in 4 weeks, there's still going to be optimization and tweaking over the next 30 to 60 days. Because there's going to be processes that aren't really efficient. There may be more data elements. You want to go through this iterative process to get it really dialed in. Then once you've got that dialed in, then you can basically spread it as fast as they're able to handle it. That's where change management, training, all of those things you have to do with organizations, because this is not a product that just runs itself. People have to, they get information, they have to take action on it. They need to know how to understand the information, and they need to know what actions to take. And that's where we're really going deep into AI now, is to help coach the employees what they should be doing. And here's an SOP on how you should train this person on this, that sort of thing. Because one thing in this industry, there's a high turnover rate. And so training is almost a constant process. And so the more we can automate that through the product, the better.
Oh man, great answer. You said something, and I want to make sure we have a chance to move to
Mhm.
some of the other things as well as we're
Sure.
talking. But I want to kind of key in on this for folks. Um, One, this is a fairly fast process. Nothing's ever directly copy and paste, but certainly once you go to one site and you have the
Hmm.
technical integrations built out, it's much more copy paste than it would be otherwise. We're talking weeks, not even months. And the change management piece is the area I wanted to focus on because a lot of people, and particularly in AI, right? That's my background, that's what we do,
Hmm.
and what we're bringing to the table. ev- everybody thinks about the technology first. And technology, at this point, that's a fully baked function, right? Nobody asks you, Dan, well, does the technology that Easy Metrics has built work? Like that's not even a question anymore. We know the technology works, but I find very few companies understand the level of change management required to activate the decisions presented by a system like yours or a system like mine. Can you talk a little bit to how you coach people through here's what the change management needs to look like, here's what you need to prepare for, and here's the buy-in level that you need to be successful, right? We'll lead you to water, but we can't make you drink. And so, how do you go through that with companies up front so they have a really clear picture of the expectations that they need to be ready to deploy across their network?
So the key on change management is that it's got to come from the top.
100%.
So you have to have, if you're at a site level, you have to have the GM say, this is a priority for us, and we've got to drive this through the organization. So, one of our great customers, Ferguson Home Supply, every single day they have a stand-up meeting in the morning going through all their metrics, and they've got hundreds and hundreds of metrics with all of their managers, and they're identifying, was this a people issue? Was this a process issue? Is this a workflow issue? Do we get some weird work that came in that made us miss our numbers? But what they do is they have eyes on these issues all the time. That will then say, okay, people at the top are saying this is important, that drives it through. If you don't, then you're going to struggle. So, when we look at like on our model, the supervisors have a group of employees that they're managing. You can very quickly see the supervisors that are embracing the change and the supervisors that aren't embracing the change, because you'll see massive performance improvements on those that are embracing the change. And so it's a matter of elevating that visibility and then making you train organizations to, okay, how do we deal with this? So when you have an associate that is not performing to standard, that's where you coach them. You give them extra training. You may say, hey, that maybe they aren't good at unloading the containers because these things are huge boxes and they're heavy and it's
Sure.
too physically demanding. So let's move them to an area that they're going to be more successful. I mean, the one thing that is, in the past, people have looked at labor management as a punitive function. I really look at it as an enhancing function because one, it's very hard to find employees still. Even though I know the labor market's shifting, warehouse workers are still very hard to get. So you really need to invest in your employees. And so when you have the information that we're able to provide, you can use that information to make best use of those associates, train them appropriately. So when we start with any organization, it's the crawl, walk, run approach. Okay, the very first thing you want to focus on is missing time. No one's going to argue about missing time, which is people are not hiding, they're not standing around, they're actually doing the work they're supposed to be doing.
Yep.
That's a really easy one. And right there, you can generally save 5 to 10% on your labor very quickly. 200 people in a facility, that's really big money. I mean, that right there is a 10x easy 10x return on our system. Then you start going to the next level. Say, okay, I want to make sure they're doing as much productive work as possible. They're not pushing a broom around the floor all the time just to kill time. I want them doing things that are driving value for my customers and driving value for my business. I stabilize those. And again, those are really easy things to do. Then we get into the hard work. Okay, my picking process efficiency for a certain group of associates is not as good as it should be. That's where you need to have observations, you need to have coaching, and that's a much more involved process. And that's where you need to basically take in those SOPs, make sure the SOPs do spell out the tasks, the training, and it's more involved there. And again, it's an iterative process within the organization. Then you get that optimized. Then you have your continuous process improvement people, your industrial engineers. They then start looking at that resultant data. They start analyzing across the network and say, okay, here's where we can start making more improvements, more efficiencies, more investments to drive, to drive the best business possible.
Yep. And for folks listening, right, I think when you look at change management, you want to pick something tangible. And you gave some really good examples. I always recommend companies think of it as, the Pareto effect, which is, what is the least amount of work we can do to get the most value? And so when we
Hmm.
look at facilities and when we're doing
Exactly.
organization, it's okay, well, if you're a massive manufacturing facility that's not shaped like a rectangle, there's a heck of a lot of value in doing better door assignment and door optimization and planning around how you're using your doors because traveling from one side of the building to the other is not a 2-minute task. It's a 10-minute drive, right? And that's it. I mean, sites will lose 30% of their time just making those
Hmm.
drives continuously, right? That's an easy thing for us to do and target and show metrics on. But then the other thing on change management, this is something that we've learned as we've grown as a business, is deploying one site, the first site, the change management's always the hardest. But once you get beyond the first site, when you're going through this process of building out a unified data model, implementing all sorts of metrics or implementing orchestration, you can start to gamify the process of change management. And so what we see is we have customers where they literally will show up and they're like, all right, here's the report card. So we track for one of our
Hmm.
customers every site's compliance to optimal for every week, right? What moves did you do that you needed to do? When did you do them? Where did you not listen? Where did you break optimal? How much further did you travel than you needed to? There's all these numbers that we present to them. And it turns out the sites, they can see that all of the performance metrics of the site as it pertains to cost per unit are a one-to-one correlation with compliance to optimality. Sure
Hmm.
enough, maths. And so sites start to compete against not as what is our CPU, because some sites might have more inbound and other sites might have more picking, right? You can't control that.
Right.
What you can control is if you're really close to optimal, you are hitting almost, as close to the optimal metrics as you can for a facility. If you're managing your labor effectively, right? And you want to compete in that fashion. So we've taken an output of what we're solving and created competition around that output, much like you can do with an LMS in a
Hmm.
positive way instead of viewing it as punitive, much to your point. And
Yeah,
so, go
exactly.
ahead.
I mean, we do that with pay for performance on an individual level, because now all of a sudden if they get a really good score, they can make more money, or you can give them points and soft rewards and so forth. And we used to run these operations ourselves as a 4PL. And we found that when you gave that sort of incentive or positive feedback, it made the work fun. Even though the work's physical and hard, it's very motivating. Hey, I just crushed it today. They go home, they feel good, versus not having any idea how they did and just punching a clock, punching in time. Yeah, I
Yeah,
want to go back to one thing that you said about change management. You've got to get small wins as fast as possible.
yeah,
That's the key. Because as soon as you start getting those small victories and you then the upper management starts to see the ROI going, whoa, we've already saved a couple percent. Then all of a sudden that momentum, that snowball starts to roll and then it just storms through the whole organization. If you take a traditional model where you're doing a year-long build of a big enterprise thing, and then it's like, hey, we're flipping the switch. It's like everyone's exhausted by the time you turn the switch on. So get them up and running ASAP, get them some value, and then incrementalize into that because now you have the ROI, you've got the momentum, and it makes it much easier to drive it through the organization.
yeah. I don't know if change management burnout is like a real thing or like a term that
Oh, it
exists,
is.
but it sure as heck should be.
It totally is.
Um, oh man. Okay. So let's talk kind of the next level. So we have
Hmm.
our unified data model at this point. Easy metrics is humming away. Auto schedulers humming away. AI is the future, right? Decision agents are everywhere, right? We offer one with auto scheduler.
Hmm.
Plug. It's free for anybody who wants to use it. But this unified data model is kind of the way that we are setting the stage for the future of AI in operations. Can you talk a little bit about how you expect this to work, where you see decision agents going, kind of some of the steps that companies should start to think about taking on top of these data models to become successful in the next 12 to 18 months? Not,
Hmm.
this is the 10-year vision. We'll talk about that in a bit.
Yeah. So how we're approaching it is, we built an entire agentic framework, and then we have agents for each of the roles. So like we
Yep.
have our executive network agent that basically extracts the KPIs across the entire network, monetizes those KPIs, saying, look, if you did this, you'd save $400,000. And we bring that forward to them. So we're doing a role-based agentic model. But we also then spend a lot of time interviewing our customers because we find all sorts of creative ways of how they use the data. So again, going back to Ferguson, they're the ones that probably 6 or 7 years ago turned us on to what we call metric ratios. So, on any given process, I could have up to 20 different metrics that go into that process. And picking a really good metric ratio is, what's my feet traveled per line picked? Because that right there is going to tell you,
Yep.
what's really going on in the facility, especially across your network. And so there's all these different metric ratios that you can look at And then again, instead of having to go calculate them in a spreadsheet, AI can go grab those and say, okay, you're getting process variance in these different facilities. Going deeper into it, your metric ratios are out of a line. You may need to invest in slotting software or something like that so you have more efficient pick patterns.
Yeah.
So what we do is we work with our customers and find out from them, because they have so many smart people, process engineers and industrial engineers, how are you using our data? Because labor management data is one of the most valuable data sources because it's so highly transformed. It's already done all those pre-calculations. So in a sense, your unified data model is going to have that. So you talk to those individuals, and then what we do then is we build those as machine learning investigations. So we can build that as a script that does all of those calculations for them, and then that becomes part of the agent for that specific role that they're looking for. So what is how should I optimize my staffing for overtime? What is my true cost of overtime? For the industrial engineers, boy, they love it because there's so many different ways to slice and dice this. But instead of them having to grind spreadsheets and do, I mean, gosh, we've got billions of rows of data for some clients. You can't do that on a spreadsheet. It blows it
Yep.
up. So we can do all that in the background for them and then just elevates it to them. It's like, here's the problem. Then they can click on that. It takes them right to the dashboards and allows them to drill down and really figure out what is going on.
And
So that's how we're approaching, and everything we do is math because we're all about calculated data. We're not really into we do have language models in there, but reality is it's the deriving the math out of the data.
yeah, and that's so you're hitting on a really key point. And
Hmm.
before I'm gonna go on my long, it won't be long, but my diatribe about
Yeah.
agents. But for folks, right? Agentic AI is a really common term used these days. Maybe let's back up a step and can you just kind of define what that means for easy metrics and how do you define an agent? Um, and then I'll kind of talk about what you just said, and which aligns perfectly with my
Hmm.
definition.
So for me, what an agent is what is a person doing with our information. So it could be is I'm going into a different dashboards to find this problem. The agent can do that for them and say, hey, looking across your 400 facilities, boom, here are your problems. So they don't have to go find it themselves.
Yep.
So then we can go find the problem, we can monetize the problem, and then we can also, in many cases, diagnose the problem. So it just streamlines the grinding work that they would have to do. So then we can't often tell them how to fix the problem because it's very nuanced to the operation. But it's like,
Certainly.
here's what it is, here's what it costs, here are the things that are out of whack there. And then they're going to sit there and go, oh, well, this is what we can do to fix it.
Yep.
Sometimes we can, but generally they're going to, it's you just know how it is. Data shines the light, but you still, we haven't got to the point where the nuances of understanding of that operation, can be described, I guess.
Yep. And this is, I get wrapped around the axle on this because you know this, my background in machine learning and AI. I get into a lot of academic debates about the topic. And a lot, so we released our agent, the very first version for free, and somebody looks at a demo and they're like, well, it's not operating with agency and making decisions in your demo. At which point you come back and say, well, that's not really a fundamental
Yeah.
challenge in yet is probably a good question, but that's not the fundamental challenge in agents today. Is so an example of this is we have email capabilities we've built into our agent, the free one and the one that our
Hmm.
customers are getting that's underlying all the data and the semantic modeling. And I said, if I told you that that agent could read all your emails, respond to your emails, use all the data in its purview, and consistently do that, if you want it to write you emails to your carriers, letting them know what's going to be late ahead of time, it can do all of that. It just say the word and we'll turn that on. Are you going to say yes? And the answer is almost always no. Like, oh my God, you're telling me that you want this thing? I would never let that run in my operation. Like some
Hmm.
person, their hair's on fire, right? And so I want to make the distinction for folks on the call is that instead of getting into the academic debate of does the agent actually have agency to freely make decisions, think about it as an advisor for the current state. And when people are comfortable enough and the change management has been done to the degree that we are accepting of autonomous decision making at certain levels, that's not a technology problem. in what we're talking about. That is very much so a risk tolerance problem, more so
Hmm.
than anything. And that gets into, right, you defined agents really well. Like my definition is there is a unified data model with semantic layers on top, things that understand that data and how that data translates to decisions. And then the last piece is that large language model that understands the environment and can communicate with that data in the environment to either enact decisions, trigger decisions, recommend decisions, or highlight changes to the data that are of interest or notable to people. And when we're really thinking about agentic AI, that's extremely powerful, but part of why we put ours out for free is the thing that makes an agent valuable isn't the fact that ChatGPT is running it. It's the unified data and the understanding of that data and that semantic modeling. And that's something you have, that's something I have.
Hmm.
But particularly with the influx of venture capital powered agents in supply chain, it's a huge gap that I think a lot of companies don't necessarily recognize. I don't know
Yeah,
if
let me
there's
give you
any thoughts on
yeah,
that from your
yeah,
perspective.
let me give you a metaphorical example. So my brother's a pilot for Delta Airlines. And he says on a 15-hour flight, he'll maybe touch the stick for 5 minutes, and that's always on the takeoff. Because the takeoff, for whatever reason, there's crosswinds. They haven't really got the autopilot dialed in, but the planes almost always land on autopilot. So you've got four pilots on a route that's going to fly to China because you have your pilot, your captain, and your co-pilot, and then you have a team because they have to swap out after so many hours. They barely touch the stick. What
Yeah,
are they there for when things don't work right? Okay. So, I mean, and think of how many hundreds of thousands of flights a day go on globally, and it's almost fully automated. They still want people there as a governing agent to make sure if something doesn't go right, that they can take care of it. So, it's great for 99% of the use cases, maybe to let the agents do everything. But that 1% that it doesn't do it right, you don't have that common sense layer there because it's outside of that, you can blow up your business. And
100%.
that you see that with the trading models. It's like the fully automated trading model. It's like, wow, you see what happens when a fat finger hits it, it costs billions of dollars. What happens if an agent runs out of control in a
Yep.
trading model and you could have trillions of dollars get blown up? So, software does not have common sense, and I don't think it ever will, because common sense comes from something different than just a pure intellectual model. And so I think we're a ways away from true agentic agency until you have everything so standardized to perfection. And the supply chain is so far away from everything being standardized to perfection. I mean, it's
I was
just
going to say that.
so far away. Manufacturing an iPhone, you're building 100 million of these things, and it's exactly the same thing. That's one thing. Supply chain is all over the place, and I think we're still a long way. I know Amazon's driving towards it, but they still have thousands of people in every distribution center along with those robots. So
Yep.
um they'll be chipping away at it, but I think we're a long ways away still.
I agree. I agree. And where I will say just a little bit of a futurist comment, and I think we probably have time for one or two more kind of
Hmm.
topics, but a futurist comment on agents is I do see a world in the next 2 to 5 years, and I'm leaving the time frame very vague, where you do start to have intra or inter-agent communication. So my agent that understands everything about the warehouse and what needs to be done could communicate with your agent, which knows who is doing well and where they're performing well. And they might even be able to interact and make decisions amongst each other or recommend decisions based on it's no longer just the database and semantic model I have access to,
Hmm.
but how can my system leverage everything that you have in your system to make the whole system and the whole supply chain more intelligent? I do think we will have that agent to agent communication.
I agree.
Mm,
It'll be on low risk things though. I mean, to your
100%.
point, you got to de-risk everything. So it's like, okay, what if this thing goes off the rails? What's the worst thing that's going to happen? You need to kind of weigh it into that spectrum.
And that's going to depend by the business. And
Absolutely.
so speaking of things that introduce risk, data, um, bad data, notably, right? So we talked about earlier how you do the decision mapping of data, the right team to have in
Hmm.
place. The reality is, right, I remember rolling out to a customer and I said, "Hey, I noticed some of these appointment times are different and you don't have any live loads. What's going on?" And they're like, "Oh, anything with a one at the end of the data is a live load. At the appointment time is a live load, and we just know that." Right? So there's no real foundational data, but they had the data. There are a lot of companies that don't have the data or have bad values in data. And we are mathematics companies at the end of it, right? We are only as good as the data that we are able to operate on and the cleanliness that we can get out of that data. How do you think about that? And I'm happy to share kind of some of the things AutoSchedule is
Mhm.
doing as well to deal with imperfections in the systems that we interact with.
So, from a WMS perspective, generally, you're not going in and altering those transactions. You might be updating certain things. What we've done with some of our more sophisticated clients is we do what we call run-to-run data modeling. So we're able to, because everything's now the way the data flows, you want to make sure you're ingesting the data. Sometimes you have errors in the data set, you have those things. So we put a lot of QC checks in place to make sure we're getting all that information. And then when they update the information, because we'll run and calculate it all, but then they're like, oh, they'll do an update on the information because maybe someone entered something wrong.
Mhm.
We then will grab that and we will do that. So we then send them signals back, basically telling them, here's the data we ingested, here are the results, and then they're able to do a comparative model on their end. So that way we always make sure we have that tight synchronization, because that is a very big deal
Yep.
for these groups. Otherwise, then you have manual intervention that gets expensive. It's time intensive. It's often not caught for several days, and so automating that on that level is absolutely critical. The thing with what we do is, like I look at your business, you're orchestrating things. So if you get bad data, you may misorchestrate something where all of a sudden you've got a big problem on your hand because you're getting a big
Yep.
bottleneck there. We're not an orchestration platform. We're really about, giving you that granular understanding of everything that's happening so then you can diagnose your business and drive the change. So when an error does occur, it's not nearly the critical level as what you're going to find because you're
Yep.
dictating workflows. I don't dictate workflows. I can dictate recommendations. A human's still there saying, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to move 10 people over here. We don't just reroute the WMS to move those 10 people over there.
Yeah. And yeah, I used to joke about it, but like we could sell a whole service of being an item master cleanup for a lot of companies because what we ended up, one of the biggest challenges we had when we first came out is we would deliver to a site and we look at all the work that we were planning, like, and that load is going to take you 432 hours. Oh, turns out, you know, you have one case per pallet or one case per layer, one layer per pallet in your item master, and you're shipping, you know, some extraordinary number of cases. So we think that you're shipping, 12,000
Right.
on that truck, which maths to something massive. And so there's a few ways we handle it. One is certainly similar to you guys is how do we put a layer in between the data coming out and the data going in that we can clean that up if there are known problems or
Mhm.
it's not so intelligent that it's able to look in real time and say, well, this is what we think, but it is able to flag where there are problems in the data, where there are inconsistencies in the data, and then it'll map based on what we've understood and as a part of our research and part of the site walks and data kind of huddles with their team. The second thing is when we're actually doing that orchestration, we have caps on all sorts of things to where it is a highly configurable solve that we are putting out there. And that solve is going to then look at the data and say, well, every truck is taking 4.5 hours, 1 hour to 4.5 hours to work for a big CPG, for example. This looks very unrealistic that it would take 45. We're going to estimate instead it's close to the average. Right? And so there's all sorts of
Mhm.
pieces that you build in to get around the bad data so that it doesn't become an operational problem. Because if this is a site where we are advisory, it's a problem. If it is a site we're automating, it's a major problem because there might be service failures that occur because of data outages. And so, over the 5 year history of the company, we've built so much into our platform to try to
Yeah.
avoid that ever happening. Um,
Yeah, we do something similar. I mean, we basically look at the variances that occur within a process performance. And so if you have something that's way outside of that variance on the higher or the low end, it's flagged. And then that way you can say, okay, instead of, this person processing 100 lines, it was passed through that they processed 10,000 lines. Therefore, their score went through the roof.
Yep.
So errors of data like that, we have ways of flagging that and then correcting that, to them. And that's the challenge with all this stuff. There's always going to be that data correction. It's the name of the game, and when you've got sometimes 10 different data sources you're pulling from, it's exponentially increases the complexity of the problem.
100%, right? And
Mhm.
as much as I'd love to get into like Bayesian theory on outlier detection,
Yeah, we can geek out
I
like crazy, can't
I don't
we?
think anybody on this call cares. So, like, there's a lot of really cool things you can do around data.
Mhm.
Um, so
Well,
with
and I
that,
think that the
right?
bottom line is companies need to start thinking this way. They have to start thinking that their data strategically. Facebook figured that out 15 years ago, and turned data into a gold mine. And companies have the same opportunity with the data in their operations.
Exactly that. So we have just a minute or two left. Are there any closing thoughts you want to leave folks with? And we've got some last minute kind of actions for everybody. And
Mhm.
on your side, you want to highlight?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of hype about AI. I'm an old guy, so I lived through the whole dot-com collapse. You were probably still in junior high or grade school at that time, so maybe
I won't
maybe your
say.
parents' stock portfolio felt it. But I went through the whole hype cycle there, where if you're not a dot-com, you're going out of business, and it did change the world, but it doesn't change it overnight. I think that we're in a similar hype investment cycle on AI, and I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because if you don't solve the data problem first, you're going to burn a lot of money. And companies are figuring that out. Gartner, or no, it wasn't Gartner, it was MIT came out with a study a couple months ago and said that 95% of AI initiatives are getting a not a positive ROI. And that's because you're not applying it to a cost-effective data model. So companies are stepping back, say, okay, go through this process, the data inventory, the data alignment, the stakeholder alignment, that holistic picture, top down, what are we going to build for this data model? And then you start layering the AI on that, and that's where the magic happens. And so that process for, when you look at a holistic organization can take up to 18 months. When you're talking about everything, CRM, all this stuff, you got to figure out how to bring that all together and go through that. And then you can start chipping away at it with AI. And I think that's what I really want companies to understand is AI is going to change the world. It's a huge deal, but you can't put that in front of getting your data under control first. Get that done first, then you can move into these things and really, make your business just rock and roll.
I would say that is a fantastic way to end it. Could not agree
Mm.
more. For everybody that listened in, thank you so much. There is a fantastic document on data taxonomy and how to think about a unified data model that the Easy Metrics team has put together.
Mhm.
We're going to share that with you guys. Would also love for anybody who does want to start to dip their toe into AI and understand what it can do. We have the free AutoScheduler decision agent that is available for
Mhm.
anybody to use and try on how to run a warehouse. So with that, Dan, thank you so much. This has been awesome. Really appreciate everybody that listened in. Until next time, everybody have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Keith. Appreciate the opportunity.